Thank you for joining us here at the Hampton Leftist. My name is James Fauntleroy, also known as JB Font, and we are with Kshama Sawant. I'm sorry, Kshama Sawant. My apologies. She's a councilwoman for Seattle's 3rd District, and she is a socialist and a member of the Socialist Alternative. Miss Shama, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, great. Um, there's a lot of things that's currently on the news today, and I'm excited to have you on, particularly for some of the things that we'll be talking in a little while. But one of the things that I actually wanted to ask you about was you were telling me earlier um, uh, about what's going on with Palestine and how you want to encourage the condemnation of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people.
Yes, as many of us know, especially the left is aware of what's going on right now in Israel, in Jerusalem, is and in Gaza and the West Bank is the worst military assault against the Palestinian people since 2014. And it has already cost the lives of dozens of Palestinian civilians, at least 31 of them children. Hundreds more have been injured and have lost their homes. And this is in Jerusalem, all the while that Palestinians in Gaza are struggling to survive under the conditions of the pandemic, of poverty and mass unemployment and misery, and not to mention racism and imperialism. These are all conditions that even the United Nations have described as unlivable, which are the direct result of the brutal ongoing Israeli-Egyptian blockade against the Palestinian people. And this is extremely important for us to recognize also, because in America there are so many parallels between the way the Palestinian people have been oppressed to how our Black community members in the United States have been oppressed. You know how the metaphor for the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer last year was, the U.S. regime, the police have their hand, and the system of capitalism itself have their knee on the neck of the oppressed people in the United States. I think it's a similar metaphor that has been unfolding in Gaza and in Jerusalem. And I think really there is a real opportunity for us here, not only to stand with the Palestinian people and condemn the violence of Israel, but also to understand that working class people internationally have to have solidarity amongst ourselves, because we see a common oppressor, which is the system of capitalism and imperialism and its purveyors. And last but not least, I'll also mention, let's not forget that the recent wave of violence against the Palestinians in Jerusalem began with Palestinian youth courageously opposing evictions of their families. I mean, think of that and compare that to how we've seen for decades now a massive racist gentrification against Black and working class people as a whole. And we're really struggling for the right to live, right to have a housing and safe communities for ourselves.
Yeah, and that's perfect. I appreciate that because everything you said was absolutely correct. If I remember, there was a situation where there were Black neighborhoods in central part of New York, and they basically removed them and then built Central Park in that area. So a lot of what's going on to the Palestinians really does have a crossover with a lot of, especially Black people and people of color have went through within this country as well. And so for us, there has to be a solidarity that comes together where we see the Palestinians and Black people as essentially fighting the same fight. It's just in different parts of the world.
Very true. And that's why I will be, in a few hours, I will be speaking at a protest that's being organized by activist organizations here to stand with the Palestinian people. And then tomorrow, when the city council meets for their weekly voting and meetings, we will, my office will be bringing forward a public letter addressed to Biden and to the US Congress, urging them to publicly condemn Israeli violence and to stop the military funding from US taxpayer dollars to Israel in order for them to continue this violence. So I hope that people who are watching this after the fact, will really stand against this kind of oppression and imperialism and build the kind of international solidarity that we need.
Yeah, and part of that is also part of that condemnation is taking away some of the benefits that we give to Israel. I think if I'm correct, we currently give $3.8 billion to Israel, which helps them with their defense forces. And also, we also got to be real. Israel also has universal health care, and we don't have that here in the United States. We don't have single payer Medicare for all. And so, for us to be funding Israel while they're doing this basically ethno-state type genocide against the Palestinian people, it really if we truly are about American values, then we really need to question what Israel is doing, and all the benefits that we give to Israel need to stop until they start treating Palestinians with respect and dignity.
And it really shows who benefits from this violence. It's not ordinary American people, working people who are benefiting
Exactly.
from it. Like you
Yeah.
said, we're in the richest country in the world. We don't have basics of healthcare and of housing. Every
Yes.
metropolitan area has a housing affordability crisis. How is this in the wealthiest country in the history of humanity? And a capitalist class that has become over $1 trillion richer during the pandemic, when the rest of us went through unprecedented financial suffering.
You said it better than I could. Thank you for that. One of the things that you were talking about was your your ideology of socialism. As you know, myself as well as the rest of my Fred Hampton leftist co-hosts, we are socialists. Some of us are communists. So we're definitely anti-capitalist to the 10th degree. What drove you to be in the position where you view capitalism? I mean, you already spoke about it, and you're speaking about the rights of Palestinian people in the Israeli illegal occupation. But if you can divulge a little bit into that further about how did you come to that, and I also would like to share that with you as myself as well.
Oh, absolutely, James. I'm happy to share, and I'm really interested in hearing your political journey as well. I grew up in India, and while my parents were not rich by any means, we weren't poor either. We were the sliver of the middle class that was developing at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up with not only just a feeling of sort of a passionate, oneness with the people, the millions of people who were in an ocean of misery, but also it was for me a logical question as well. How is it that in a society that is clearly quite advanced and clearly has technological capabilities that didn't exist decades ago, how is it that even in such a society you have such an indescribable divide between hundreds of millions of people who are suffering, a sliver of middle class, and then you have an even tinier sliver of extremely wealthy people who are clearly siphoning off all the wealth. So to me, it was clear from the very beginning that there is a political problem with the system, the way it's organized, not that it's endemic to humanity, that we will have poverty and suffering. I just refuse to believe what I thought, frankly, were stupid answers to questions that people gave, when I was a child, that elders gave me about, oh, well, the system is like this because of karma or because people don't work hard enough. I mean, what a load of nonsense that is. Some of the poorest people are the most hardworking people. And so I was already politically radicalizing, but then I think it took on an even bigger phenomenon once I came to the United States and saw that even in the richest country in the world, you had just an unbelievable underfunding of public services, like even public transportation, public housing, public schools. And clearly, even here, there is a chasm between the very rich and the rest of us. And so really that was, I think, a turning point for me to understand that this is a global system. And at that time, I did not have the vocabulary to describe it because I came from a very apolitical family. But then I slowly understood that this was about capitalism and that we need a different kind of society fundamentally. And that led me to understanding about socialism. And then when I moved to Seattle in 2009, I joined Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of socialists. And we collectively ran a campaign together, and we ended up winning this elected office. I think millions of people are thinking about the system and how it has failed them. That is actually what was expressed also through the Black Lives Matter protests last year. And so, yeah, I'd be really curious to hear about your story as well.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. That's a lot of us. We all have that particular type of awakening where we're asking these questions. For me, my socialist awakening happened from a very young age. When I was born. I lived in New Jersey, and I moved to Florida when I was 3. Unfortunately, we ended up being homeless when I was very little. So housing insecurity is basically deeply seated in me because we've had to deal with it ever since I was a child. Um, being either close to or living in poverty radicalizes you because you realize that there's a lot of have-nots and there's very few haves. And growing up as a child, um, a lot of times there's jokes about the type of food you have to eat because you're poor, or the type of living conditions. And so it was always told to, people of, basically our generation, all you got to do is work hard and do your best and go to college and you'll make it in this world. I've watched myself and all of our generations do the exact same thing that was recommended to us, and look where we are today. Um, Part of that awakening was I always was somewhat on the left, for the most part, but I started to see some things that I thought were just mere fantasy actually talked about as being something that can be real for people. Um, I saw a particular political YouTuber, and the first thing I heard was Medicare for all, and I was like, "Wait, what's that?" Because as somebody who's on kidney dialysis and who has Medicare, of course, in the system, Medicare pays, 80% of your bills, but you have to pick up the other 20%, and there's age limits, there's all these different things. You don't have dental, you don't have vision or, hearing, things like that. And so when I started to hear about Medicare for all, I was just like, wait a minute, everybody can have equal access to healthcare, not just equal access, just have healthcare. And no matter what your financial standing, your healthcare will be as good as the richest among you. That to me was just crazy, but crazy in a good way, because we have been so propagandized in this country to think that we only deserve these basic human rights but because of our labor, when really we deserve these basic human rights just by virtue of being a human being. So I started to move to the left. So I went to progressive, and then I heard more, and then I went to social democrat, and then I went to democratic socialist. So it's all gradual. And then by the time I started thinking about and hearing about all the atrocities that capitalism has inflicted upon us, I was just like, I'm a socialist. That's it. And then the funny part is I started studying a little bit more about history and start seeing what capitalist class has pushed as influencing our government to do, the coups that have been waged, the for-profit wars, even the crack epidemic in the Black community was because of imperialism, which is a result of capitalism. So all of that come together actually led me to start looking at capitalism as the primary big bad enemy, right? For anybody who's a gamer out there who plays video games, capitalism is the super boss. Okay, that's the one that we must defeat because it's the reason why so many people not just are dying, so many people have atrocious health issues, so many reasons why we suffer more under, with things like depression, mental health issues, some of the reasons why we have climate change issues, some of the reasons why so many of our troops go into these for-profit wars and they end up either physically maimed or mentally maimed because of these capitalist overlords that want to extract resources from countries. And I think it was I forgot Michael Parenti. He said there's no such thing as a poor nation, there's only exploited nations. And so when you come to realize that, you see capitalism for the enemy that it is. And I have came to the conclusion that socialism is pretty much the only way. So that's how that's a long-winded version of me saying that this is why, this is how I got into my socialist awakening.
No, that all makes sense to me. I really identify with that. And you're, what you quoted from Michael Parenti, that's really true, because if you look at actually the whole historical trajectory of imperialism, and also the, imperialism really was part and parcel of the beginnings of capitalism, including the institution of slavery in the United States, obviously, needless to say. But if you look at the whole history, in fact, the nations that ended up becoming the poorest are the richest. If you look at some of the richest, if you look at the resources, I mean, so many of the countries that were colonized in Latin America, in Asia, India, my home country, countries in Africa, these are all regions that have been historically incredibly wealthy in terms of resources, natural resources, and the climate that is conducive to the real sort of explosive developments in agriculture, since thousands of years. And so it really shows you that in its early days, capitalism was to some degree a progressive force. Obviously, it came with so many evils, but it ended up being a progressive force in some ways, because it was really the heralding of the new era of technological development since the industrial revolutions, of making mass production possible. And that's a progressive development, because it's better for humanity to have the basics of life that can be produced cheaply. So compared to the cottage industry and the feudal era, this was a step forward. The mass production also became an atmosphere where workers could get organized. And for the first time, the creation of a working class in reality, the birth of the idea of working workers, the exploited, getting organized into unions or combinations, as they used to call them in that day. All of that became the part of the process of the evolution of global capitalism. But it's also a reminder that if that was all true, then why should we accept as this kind of gospel truth that capitalism is now the final system? We can't have any progress since, beyond that. And I think that's why it's really important to have this sort of logical interpretation of history based in facts. And that's what I would say, as a Marxist, I think that's a very important part of our political education on the left, to understand that really the march of humanity has to be towards more and more progress. And that's what the idea of socialism represents. It represents progress away from system that is now completely defunct. It's not able to serve us. I mean, just to pick up one example that you said, about all the millions of young people in the United States who are told, put your head down, study hard, get good grades, go to college, and then you'll be set for life. The whole idea of the American dream, it's very clear, given the massive crisis of capitalism today, that that dream is not going to become reality for the vast majority of young people. And we don't have to tell them. They understand that that's true, that it's not going to work for them. Look at the crisis of student debt, over $1 trillion of student debt. Like you said, absence of healthcare, absence of affordable housing. Most young people are now in roommate situations. It is virtually impossible for young people to have their own space. I mean, all of these are examples of how this system is simply not working for us, and we need a fundamental shift. And obviously, the 900-pound gorilla is the question of climate crisis. I mean, the climate catastrophe is something that we simply have to mention when we are talking about the ways in which the system of capitalism has failed us. It is simply not going to be solved. The climate crisis is simply not going to be solved on the basis of capitalism. And we will need to move towards socialism. And what I mean, obviously, by socialism is, of course, the ability to organize society in such a way that the incredible wealth and natural resources and technological advancements can be harnessed to bring about high standards of living for all human beings on a sustainable planet, not for all of that wealth and resources to be harnessed to endlessly offer wealth to the insatiable greed of the capitalist class. I mean, you can have one or the other. You can have either the capitalist class getting more and more wealth, or you can have a society where nobody's a billionaire, nobody's a millionaire, but we can all have very high standards of living. And I think most people would want to fight for the latter kind of society.
Yeah, I mean, that's the society that I'm for. When you look up the definition for socialism, if I'm going off the top of my head, the definition of socialism is workers owning the means of production and distribution, and the means of production and distribution also being owned collectively, essentially by the community. So that being said, then, when it comes to shipping jobs overseas, we're not going to allow that. When it comes to, damaging our planet, we're not going to allow that. When it comes to committing atrocities abroad, we're not going to allow that. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of us are for socialism. But one of the things that I also wanted to bring out was, how a lot of people will say that that as time marches on, we become more more of a civilized type of society. I feel like socialism is the next step in being more civilized, but capitalism tries to hold it back. Because people dying because they don't have healthcare, to me, is uncivilized. People dying because a country wants to do imperialism by extracting your resources is uncivilized. So because of that, the next stage in a societal evolution, in my eyes, would be socialism. And so I think that what you said is absolutely correct. And like, for instance, why in the world are we not having public education tuition free up until college? We used to do it in this country, actually, in public colleges, but capitalism got a hold of it, unfortunately. So yeah, I think this was a great way to basically introduce why we are pro-worker, pro-people in a system that is anti-worker and anti-people.
I think the point about public education is also important. I mean, as an example of how you're right, James, that there were real funds that were, the real gains that were won by American working people in the previous decades, as in the form of funding for public education, public housing,
Mhm.
all the demonized and vilified projects in New York City, for example, were originally really shining examples of public housing, meaning publicly funded affordable housing for working class people. There was major public funds were won for education, to be able to have, for the people, regardless of income, to be able to have access to have education for their children. So all of these gains were won, but they didn't come as some sort of beneficence from the capitalist class and the political parties that represent them. They were won, they were hard won through struggle, and especially through victories won by the labor movement, through major strike actions, especially the general strikes in the 1930s that paved the way for the New Deal. It was, the New Deal wasn't something that was gifted to us by FDR and the capitalists. It was something that was won by workers through struggle, through strike actions, and it was through that jobs, education, all of these things were funded. But it also shows you why you cannot stop at winning such reforms. I mean, winning such reforms will be hard enough, because, keep in mind, workers have to go on strike to win these reforms, and general strike actions
Yeah.
would take a lot of courage. But then once those reforms are won, in the following decades, those reforms are snatched away from us. And that's why we have now, it's no surprise to us that for decades we have seen a real assault on public education, public teacher unions. In the United Kingdom, for example, where the labor movement won a historic victory through the National Health Service, which is, public health care. That National Health Service has been under assault for decades, ever since that victory was won. So it also shows you that we cannot stop at winning reforms. Winning reforms is going to be hard. It will need us to get organized and get united as working people across racial and gender boundaries. But at the same time, winning reforms is not going to be enough, because any reforms we win will be snatched away from us. That's why we need a fundamental shift. And I think that connects to your point about the need for democratic public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy by workers, by the community. So in other words, there is no way, for example, there's no, it's a non-starter for us to solve the climate crisis unless we fight to take the fossil fuel companies into democratic public ownership by workers, so that workers can then retool those corporations away from fossil fuels towards clean, renewable energy. And I think it really goes down, the heart of the matter is that you cannot control what you don't own. So if workers don't own these resources, we are not going to be able to decide democratically what to do with them. Same with real estate. When most of the real estate is in the hands of the billionaire class, we are not going to be able to provide public housing, affordable housing for tens of millions of American people. So the question of democratic public ownership of our economy by workers, for workers, is a central question when we talk about the transition from capitalism to socialism.
Mhm. And speaking of the community as well as real estate, I want to talk about something that you're pushing for. I'm actually going to screen share this as well. This is something, and like I told you before, when I read this, I was excited. This is what I would call a broad spectrum um, approach to housing. Um, this is renters' rights demands from our movement. I didn't just want to talk about it, I wanted to show it to people because I wanted them to see with their own eyes in black and white, these are some of the things that people should be demanding. Following your example in Seattle, across all other municipalities across this country. Um, and I would like for you to, give maybe a small little introduction on to this if you can. And then we can dive into some of these some of these provisions that would benefit those of us here, in Seattle.
Thank you, James, for sharing this. This is the backside of a leaflet that we handed out starting last week to announce a major program that renters' rights activists, housing activists, socialist union members are fighting for alongside my Socialist Council office. And obviously, as you can see from the list, the top demand and the most substantive demand here is the fight for residential rent control without corporate loopholes, because rents have been skyrocketing for over a decade in Seattle, and Seattle is no exception. We are seeing this in every metropolitan area. In fact, even in suburban areas, the rents have skyrocketed so much that housing is becoming more and more unaffordable for working people and even the middle class. So it's really showing that a broad base of American people is facing the adverse consequences of not having rent control, and it's going to be crucial. We've also talked about commercial rent control, though, because we know that not only have small businesses have faced an unprecedented devastation during the pandemic, we also know that they're struggling against skyrocketing rent themselves. And the entities that have benefited disproportionately from our system as a whole, and even stunningly during the pandemic, has been the billionaires and the multimillionaires. So we really need to unite middle-class homeowners, renters, and struggling small businesses for winning rent control, both residential and commercial, and really understand that our common enemy is corporate real estate, the property management corporations, the big banks, the Wall Street banks that underwrite these real estate deals and make untold fortunes for these rapacious investors, venture capitalists, whatever you want to call them. And so this fleet of demands really, as the leaflet indicates, is the basis for a renter's bill of rights. And I would just mention, before going on about the demands that we have currently, is that this latest movement that we are launching comes on the back of the renters' rights victories that we have already won through my socialist office and through building the power of rank and file renters, really empowering them to fight for their own rights, to get organized, to not remain isolated and atomized, but to come together, because that is the only way we can challenge the might of corporate landlords and change the balance of forces away from the corporate landlords and towards renters. And so in the 7.5 years that we have been on the city council, we have won, our movement through our office has won so many renters' rights victories that were considered unwinnable. People thought we couldn't do this, and we have showed that it is possible. And so that is the example that we are using to inspire people to say, look, we've already done it, we have won it. And last year we won the Amazon tax, which was a historic victory for the Black Lives Matter movement, because we won it during the wave of protests, because there was so much support from rank and file protesters, especially from the Black and brown community, to tax big corporations like Amazon to fund affordable social housing. So a strong renters' bill of rights, alongside taxing big business to fund a major expansion of social housing, which is publicly funded, publicly affordable housing, all of that needs to go together to make our cities affordable. I just wanted to add one thing to, in these list of demands, you'll also see one of the demands. I don't know if it's showing up on the screen right now, but there it is. There at the bottom left. Mm-hmm. James, you mentioned how the experience of being homeless as a child politicized and radicalized you. I think that's a very important point you made, because we now see that in Seattle, for example, more than 4,000 children, public school students, annually face some form of homelessness, whether they're outright homeless and living with their parents in their car, or they're couch surfing with relatives or friends, or facing housing instability by moving from one place to another. It's a major problem, and it is devastating for young people. Not only does it disrupt your experience of learning and actual schooling, but it has a real impact on your mental health, on your emotional well-being. It really scars you. And so it is a crime. It's a crime that children face housing instability in the richest country in the world. It's really an indictment of capitalism. So one of the bills that we're fighting for as part of this Renters' Bill of Rights is to ban evictions of school children and also educators and public school staff during the school year, because we know that evictions have have a devastating impact. And also it's important to build the link between evictions and homelessness. In Seattle, studies have found that 9 out of 10 evictions result in homelessness. And I have no doubt that we see similar stunning connection between evictions and homelessness in other cities as well. So that's why it's important to ban evictions of school children and their educators during the school year, because 9 times out of 10, if you're going to get evicted, you're going to end up becoming homeless.
Yeah. And that interferes with children who are in school, to properly learn and get a good education. And even educators, it's hard to, do your job when you know that you don't have a home to go to, you know. And one of the things that I also like, and this is kind of putting it in a nutshell. When you do things for the people, when you're trying to do things for the people, it can be done. All it takes is a coming together and an organizing to do it. Because all the successes that you have done was because, number one, you did it for the people, and number two, you organized, and because it can be done. One of the things that I started clapping like a seal when I saw this was ban the use of credit checks. I'm just going to read it from here. It says most rental histories do not require a credit check because in reality, credit checks have very little bearing on whether a prospective tenant will actually pay their rent. The Seattle Renters Commission has proposed Seattle prohibit the use of credit checks in rental histories, calling them essentially a form of redlining. Amen. And that's one of the things that I have had to endure, as well as many other renters have had to endure, where you go in and they go, oh, we need to do a credit check before we can approve you on the lease. And it's like, what? My credit is horrible because of the system that we live in, but my rental history is great. But you can't still get in because your credit is bad. Mind you, the entire history of the credit rating system, the credit rating numbers, the FICO score, I think it's called, started in 1988, and so I'm older than the FICO score, and so many of us are older than that, and it's just another barrier that capitalists use to keep the wealth inequality as wide of a gap as it is possible.
Absolutely, you're totally right. It is about keeping that wealth gap intact. It's one of the weapons the capitalist class uses to keep that wealth gap not only intact but constantly growing. I mean, it's grown to unbelievable degrees right now. It's also a way of doing divide and conquer among working people, to keep them from being united. Divide the most vulnerable workers who have the most vulnerable, most precarious financial situations from somewhat well-off middle class or well-paid workers, so that they feel that, okay, at least I'm not as bad as these guys. And so
Yeah.
prevent them from finding the unity that they actually need to build. We need to build, for example, the only way of really fighting back against Amazon and Jeff Bezos's excesses is for both the tech workers and the warehouse workers to get united. And that's why it's really important to have seen that kind of courage amongst workers, where they say, well, I may be a better paid worker, but I am also being exploited. And furthermore, this system is completely dysfunctional no matter how well you're paid. And so I think the credit checks are one way, one of the many countless ways in which the system exerts its divide and conquer. And I think, to your point, James, it's really important what you noted, because we've heard from so many renters who say, if you look at my credit history, its credit score, it's not going to be good, but I have never missed paying rent. And so really having credit checks does not, as the synopsis says, does not give a guarantee of rent payment to the landlord. But what it does do is allow these property management corporations and rapacious landlords to carry out poor screening, low income screening, black and brown screening, to make sure that housing is available only to the most well-off, the most financially secure, which also happen to be predominantly white workers. And so it really shows you, as the Seattle Renters Commission said, that it is a form of modern redlining, and we have to reject it as such. And it's going to be a real fight to win many of this. And can I just say, it's not only is it exploitative to use these credit checks, but look at the kind of blatant sort of hypocrisy this is, that the banks that caused the economic collapse in 2008, what are their credit scores? I mean, they hacked their organizations, their corporations. Yeah. And what happened? Did they face any consequences? No, instead they got bailed out by the Obama administration on the taxpayers' dime. And who are the taxpayers? It's predominantly working class people and working people as a whole, the middle class, people, ordinary people who go to work every day and sell their labor to make an income. Those are the taxpayers. And who benefited from that? It is these giant corporations. It's the billionaire class. And who suffered in the 2008 crisis? Remember the foreclosure crisis? 6 million foreclosures. It was ordinary working class and middle class families who were evicted from their homes, even though it was no fault of theirs. And so it really, we should see the credit checks for renters as the evil that it is, not only in terms of what it, the disconnect between that and the ability to pay rent, but also as a blatant, way in which the system lets the corporations go scot-free and, criminalizes poverty, criminalizes poor people.
Exactly. One of the other things that I was looking at, and I actually talked about this with my mother, and her eyes got big, but she was like, this is a good thing. 6 months, 180 days notice for rent increases. Like, if you're renting someplace and they give you 6 months to let you know that your rent will be increased, that's a huge benefit, because that gives you time. Well, maybe I should start looking for another place, or or it just gives you enough advance to know, okay, my rent's going to go up so many dollars, and it's good to know these things in advance. I mean, that's just logical and decent way of doing business, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, what's interesting here is that this demand for 6-month notice for rent increases, and keep in mind that's for any rent increases, is, as far as we're concerned, we've brought this forward as a stopgap measure, but we would much rather win rent control. But the reason we've brought this forward, rent control means, in our view, what we mean by rent control, and the way we have drafted the legislation, is that rent control would mean that for all rental homes, regardless of what kind of home they are, when they were built, and so on, no rent increase can be greater than the inflation rate. So in other words, the inflation rate is 2%, 3%, whatever. The rent increase cannot be beyond that. And furthermore, you will need 6 months notice for any rent increase. So really, it has to be a combination of the two. But the reason we are going to go for this also, in addition to rent control, is that the state of Washington has banned rent control. And they banned rent control 40 years ago in response to a movement in the 70s for rent control. So in other words, that's how the ruling class and their political representatives will try and punish movements. And that is why it is so important for us to get organized and win this time. We don't want to lose, just like the movement that lost 40 years ago. And we have to keep in mind also that right now in the Washington state legislature, the House is dominated by the Democrats. The Senate is dominated by the Democrats. The governor's mansion has a Democrat. In other words, the Democrats have every possible opportunity to do something good for renters, but they're not doing it. Instead, what they did recently in their recent session was they sunsetted the eviction moratorium, and the eviction moratorium is going to end on June 30th. And so on June 7th, my office is bringing forward a resolution demanding that the mayor extend the eviction moratorium because so many people are in crisis. And that's why just above the 6-month demand, you can see our demand to cancel COVID debt for working class renters and homeowners, because we know that even though many people might have got their jobs back, they have accumulated thousands of dollars of debt that's not just going to disappear. And we need to cancel the debt, meaning that the big banks, the real estate corporations, the corporate landlords, and big corporations should absorb that debt. Working class people should not have to pay for this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That makes absolute sense. This is another piece that you had for helping renters facing eviction. And one of the things that caught my eye was if the reason for eviction, if the landlord raises the rent 10% or more, your proposal is that it assists renters with triple the previous rent. So it provides the first last month's rent plus security deposit. And the landlord who raises the rent will be the one that pays it if they raise your rent. I wish this was in place because that literally is happening to me right now. Literally. So
you're having to move because the landlord is increasing rent.
I can't move because one of the reasons why I can't move is because every place else is actually more expensive.
Oh, right.
So if I move, I'll be in an even worse situation. So I have no choice but to pay this 10% increase in my rent. And we're already paying over 40% of our income on rent. And any higher rent is going to make it even harder for us to live.
Absolutely. In fact, you're right to put numbers on it, because if you're paying anything more than 30% of your income in rent, then you are rent burdened. In other words, you're paying too much of your income in rent, which means it leaves you too little left over for funding your other needs, like healthcare, especially in the absence of Medicare for all, like food, other costs, and so on, especially for children. And so again, this is something that we would want in the absence of rent control. Obviously, if we had rent control, rents wouldn't be increasing by anything like 10%. But if the rents did increase by that amount in the absence of rent control, then absolutely we feel that the landlord owes the tenant this minimum payment because the tenant is having to move because the rents went up. So that should be the landlord's responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is wonderful because this protects, because there's protections for homeowners, yes, of course, but when it comes to renters, they forget about us. And I am also disabled as well. So for someone like me, this would be a huge help, because a lot of us, some of us are ineligible for things like Section 8, or we are eligible, but the list is over 5 years long. So it's like, what do we do in the meantime? Or if we can't become eligible for it. So we need different protections for people who may fall through the cracks.
Right. We need both, that's the thing. People are slammed in from all directions. You have rental units that are too expensive, and then you have publicly funded affordable housing that is disappearing. So that's why the wait lists are so long for housing authority, Section 8 vouchers, because the funding for affordable housing, publicly funded affordable housing, has been cut to the bone over the last many decades. And that's why you see so many people who could otherwise have been in affordable social housing having to rent in the for-profit market and really losing because the rents are going up to such a degree that people are getting pushed out over and over again. And even if they didn't face an official police enforced eviction, you end up having economic evictions, meaning when your rent goes up, you're forced to move, you're forced to double up with another family, forced to couch surf with your friend. I mean, people are in such crisis right now.
Yeah. Or even because I count this as someone being homeless. If you have to go to a hotel, because there's a lot of people who they will have to move, not a hotel. A lot of times people will have to move into a motel because either one, they can't afford their rent, or they are trying to look for a place, but because of the credit checks, they get denied. And so I've known a lot of different people who have had to go through this, and some people had had to go through this multiple times, not just once or twice. And so it's unconscionable and it is immoral for people to have to go through this in the richest country in the history of the world.
Absolutely. In fact, you're totally right. In fact, at our, just to add another example to it, at the press conference last Wednesday when we unveiled this whole renters bill of rights, including the fight for rent control, one of the speakers at the press conference is he's a doctoral student in mathematics at the University of Washington, and he said that he has lived in such housing precarity that he has had to move 11 times in the 11 years that he has been in Seattle. So moving once every year at the minimum. So this is a situation that a lot of people are in. You're like a traveling renter. You have to pack your bags and go to another place that's maybe a tiny bit more affordable until that becomes unaffordable. Then you go to another place and so on. And it never ends. There is
Yeah.
no housing stability.
And moving is also expensive. Let's not forget the expense of moving itself. Because
Absolutely. Moving is expensive. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to take time off of work sometimes. On top of that, you also have to have a means to move your things. Has anybody ever priced how much it costs a U-Haul to get a U-Haul?
Oh, it costs thousands of dollars just to move. In fact, remember somebody said you have to be rich to be poor. If you look at how
Yeah.
poor and working class people and young people especially are exploited, it's like, you when you're poor, you get worse credit, meaning you pay greater interest rate on the same loans that somebody well off will get a much better interest rate. So to get the same home or car or whatever it is, you're going to end up paying far more to the banks than somebody more well off than you. Same thing, if you're well off, you're not having to move so often, and so you save on the moving cost. So in other words, every which way you look at it, you have to be rich to be poor.
Yeah, perfect synopsis of that. I wanted to quickly go into, because we're running out of time. I did not I mean, I knew this conversation would go well, but I didn't know it was going to go this well. This is amazing. Um, but one of the things I want to give you credit for is the article here. It says mass pressure forces Biden to reverse position on Big Pharma's vaccine patents. And it's even covered in the New York Times. It says, taking extraordinary measures, Biden backs suspending patents on vaccines. And you were one of the integral parts of this. And first of all, I want to say thank you for helping out this. And to our viewers, what this basically means is that the vaccine patents are suspended so that other countries like South Africa and India are able to get the patents for the get the
so that they're able to produce generic versions
exactly. Thank you for the correction. Able to produce generic versions for the vaccine so that they can mass produce it in their countries to vaccinate their entire populations as well, thus bringing down the amount of people that are subject to getting COVID or dying from COVID.
Exactly. So in other words, public health experts have told us, there's no question right now, we absolutely need an urgent access to the COVID-19 vaccinations to be made available to billions of people in order to prevent what could be millions of deaths, not to mention the whole human population being vulnerable unless billions of people are vaccinated. So it shows you how completely insane and absurd the capitalist system is, that even when the health of global humanity is at risk, the system still prioritizes profits for a few people versus the health of the vast majority of humanity. And the movement that we built in Seattle, which included the resolution that came from my office that forced the city council Democrats, I mean, all the other city council members are Democrats, but they were forced to sign on to this resolution because of the public pressure. And our resolution, as you correctly said, demanded that the Biden administration stop playing the role that they were playing in the WTO, that were blocking the countries around the world from developing their generic vaccines. Unfortunately, of course, the fight is far from over, because the WTO, the World Trade Organization, operates on the consensus. They call it consensus, and I'm putting air quotes around it because it's certainly not consensus of ordinary people. Like you and I, James, we're not invited to to tell them what they should do with the vaccines.
Yeah.
It's only it's the capitalist state machinery of the richest countries. So in other words, it's not ordinary people in rich countries that get to weigh in, and it's certainly not ordinary people in the poor countries that get to weigh in, but it's the capitalist class of various rich countries that get to decide. And so right now, even though Biden was forced to concede, which is extremely important, it's a really important step forward for our struggle for vaccine internationalism, we still see the European Union, especially Germany, opposing this. And what they're defending really, whether it's Biden or Germany, what they're defending is not only the profits of big pharma today. What they are well aware of is that if our struggle for vaccine internationalism and generic vaccines was to win today, if the WTO was actually forced to concede, which of course we need to continue to fight to make them concede, but if they did concede and they understand this, that would mean that future movements would be empowered to force the WTO to back down. That's how victories for working class people work. They always, as you said earlier, when we fight, we can win. But it also, what it does is, not only do you win what you won just now, it provides impetus for future victories. And that is why the capitalist class opposes any little thing you will fight for. Sometimes people will ask me, why do the billionaires oppose this small thing? Well, the reason they oppose it is because it's not going to be this small thing. They know that we will feel empowered to win more, which is why we should keep fighting, because we know that we will inspire future struggles as well.
That was absolutely. This is something that absolutely needs to be done, especially not just from the electoral side, but also the activism side. Um, one of the things that you get to a point where you feel as if electoral politics is a failed thing.
Extremely.
I'm sorry. It's Kshama Sawant. Sorry for the technical difficulty. And just again, she is the councilwoman for Seattle's 3rd district, a socialist and a member of the Socialist Alternative. And I just want to thank her. And I'll probably bring her back on to give her a thanks for this interview. But thank you so much for joining us today. And this was an amazing conversation. And you can follow her. Let me see, at CM Kshama, That's CMKSHAMA. You can follow her on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter at JBFont. And this has been the JB Font Show on Sunday, and I will see you in the next one.